May 29th, 1453. Constantinople. The sound is the first thing that breaks the world. It is not the orderly clash of steel or the disciplined roar of an army. It is an inhuman hum, a planetary vibration of 100,000 throats chanting in unison, a sound that seems to emanate from the very earth, shaking the foundations of the 1,000-year-old Theodosian walls. Then comes the smell, a hellish potpourri of existence's end. The sweet, cloying stench of blood mixing with the acrid bite of sulfur from Greek fire, the dust of pulverized limestone, the metallic tang of fear sweat, and the suffocating smoke of countless fires beginning to devour the Queen of Cities. The light is a fractured, demonic dawn, the rising sun obscured by a black pall of cannon smoke, casting everything in a surreal, blood-red twilight. Through a breach in the Kirkoporta gate, a tide of humanity pours in. The Janissaries, faces pale with fanaticism and the promise of a 3-day sack. Their white felt hats a ghostly wave crashing against the last vestiges of Roman order. They are a force of nature, a steel avalanche that the last 8,000 defenders, a collection of Genoese mercenaries and desperate Constantinopolitans, can no longer hold back. At the heart of this controlled hurricane, a 21-year-old man on a white stallion observes the unfolding apocalypse. His face, framed by a dark beard and a high, intelligent brow, is impassive, a mask of icy calm. He is not reveling in the slaughter. He is absorbing it, metabolizing the death of a civilization into the fuel for his own. This is not mere conquest. It is a consummation. The young sultan, Mehmed II, has just seized the world's greatest prize, the city coveted by caliphs and khans for centuries. He has just extinguished the last flickering candle of the Roman Empire. This is the narrative of him, Mehmed, the Fatih, the conqueror. This was the saga of a man who held two profoundly contradictory souls within a single breast. The soul of a Ghazi, the holy warrior of Islam whose sacred duty was to expand the dominion of the faith, and the soul of a Roman Caesar, a calculating statesman obsessed with the idea of universal empire. To understand this man, we must grapple with the central paradox of his life, a riddle that has echoed through the centuries. How could the very person who physically and symbolically annihilated the Second Rome, extinguishing its 1,000-year flame, simultaneously and with absolute conviction declare himself its legitimate heir and successor? What kind of ambition, what kind of audacious vision allowed him to stand amidst the ruins of a civilization he had just shattered and proclaim himself the new Caesar? Was this the act of a political genius, a masterstroke of propaganda designed to legitimize his new world order in the eyes of both East and West? Or was it something deeper, a messianic delusion, the conviction of a man who believed he was not an ender of histories, but a unifier of them, the destined ruler to merge the legacies of Rome and the Turks into a single, world-spanning imperium? The entire chronicle of his life, from his tormented youth to his final mysterious death, is an attempt to answer this core question. A quest to understand the mind of the conqueror who sought to wear the crown of the conquered. To understand this man, we must return to the world of his birth, a geopolitical chessboard teetering on the brink of a new, violent era. The mid-15th century was a world of ghosts and hungry new powers. In the West, the 100 Years' War between England and France was sputtering to its bloody conclusion, leaving both kingdoms exhausted, their chivalric ideals shattered on the fields of Crécy and Agincourt. The Holy Roman Empire was a fractured mosaic of competing princes, its imperial authority more theory than reality. The great maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, were the true powers of the Mediterranean, their fleets like webs spun across the sea, their wealth built on the lucrative trade routes to the east, routes that passed directly through the city that obsessed Mehmed. And at the heart of this Christian world sat the papacy in Rome, a power weakened by schism and corruption, its calls for crusade against the encroaching Turks often falling on the deaf ears of kings more concerned with their own local rivalries. The great antagonist of the past, the Mongol horde, had shattered its successor states, the Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate, now fighting amongst themselves, creating a power vacuum in the vast steppes. It was into this world of fading empires and nascent nations that the Ottoman state had exploded. They were the newcomers, the hungry wolves at the door of old Europe. Less than a century and a half before Mehmed's birth, they were a minor Turkish beylik in Anatolia. Now they controlled vast swathes of the Balkans and Anatolia, their domains stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Their state was not a kingdom. It was a war machine, built for constant expansion, fueled by the Ghazi spirit and organized with a ruthless pragmatism that baffled the feudal monarchies of Europe. And at the center of this world, like a dying jeweled spider in a crumbling web, was Byzantium. It was an empire in name only. Its territory shrunk to the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered holdings. It was a ghost city, filled with magnificent churches and decaying palaces, its population a fraction of its former glory. It was a hollow crown, a symbol of immense power and prestige, waiting for a hand strong enough to seize it. This was the world that awaited Mehmed, a world ripe for a conqueror who possessed the vision and the ruthlessness to reshape it entirely. The character of this conqueror was forged in the crucible of a deeply dysfunctional and dangerous royal family, a world defined by the shadow of a brilliant but mercurial father and the ever-present threat of the silken cord. Mehmed was born in 1432, the son of Sultan Murad II, a complex ruler who was both a formidable warrior and a Sufi mystic, a man who repeatedly tried to abdicate the throne to pursue a life of contemplation, only to be dragged back by the ceaseless demands of the state. This paternal ambivalence created a deep instability in Mehmed's youth. He was not the favored son. His older half-brother Ahmed was the designated heir. Mehmed's mother was likely a slave concubine, giving him a status anxiety that would fuel his ambition for his entire life. The core of the Ottoman system, the curse of its succession, was the law of fratricide. There was no primogeniture. Upon a sultan's death, all his sons had an equal claim to the throne, and the one who succeeded was expected, even obligated, to eliminate his brothers to prevent civil war. This turned the royal household into a viper's nest of intrigue and paranoia, where a brother's love was a liability and survival depended on outmaneuvering one's own blood. Mehmed's childhood was a masterclass in this brutal reality. He saw his older brothers die, one after another, under mysterious circumstances, clearing his own path to the throne. This was not a world that bred compassion. It bred a profound and chilling understanding of power in its most naked form. It taught him that power was absolute, indivisible, and had to be defended with preemptive ruthlessness. The other defining trauma was his cage, the gilded prison of princes, where potential heirs were kept in luxurious but isolated confinement, a practice designed to prevent them from raising armies against their father. It was in this isolation that he developed a ferocious intellect, devouring books on history, science, and military strategy, becoming fluent in multiple languages, and nursing a deep, secret resentment against the world that had made him a pawn. His character was thus forged in paradox. a refined scholar with the instincts of a predator, a man of immense culture who understood that survival in his world depended on an utter lack of sentimentality. His first taste of the throne was not a triumph, but a searing public humiliation that would become the defining psychological wound of his life. In 1444, when Mehmed was just 12 years old, his father Murad II, in another fit of world weariness following a peace treaty with Hungary, shocked the court by abdicating and retiring to a life of quiet contemplation in Anatolia. The boy Mehmed was proclaimed sultan. It was a disaster. The great powers of Europe, seeing a child on the Ottoman throne, immediately saw an opportunity. The Pope declared the peace treaty void, and a massive crusader army, led by the Hungarian King Ladislaus and the brilliant general John Hunyadi, was assembled to drive the Turks from Europe. The young sultan was powerless, a puppet in the hands of his powerful Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, a man who secretly distrusted the ambitious young prince and likely favored a more pliable candidate. The court was paralyzed by factionalism, the army was restive, and the crusader threat loomed. Faced with imminent invasion and a crisis he could not control, the boy sultan was forced into the ultimate indignity, writing a letter to his retired father, begging him to return and save the state. Murad reluctantly agreed, returned to lead the Ottoman army, and crushed the Crusaders at the decisive Battle of Varna. But for Mehmed, the victory was a bitter one. He was unceremoniously pushed aside, his authority exposed as a sham. 2 years later, following a Janissary revolt that Halil Pasha may have secretly instigated, Mehmed was formally deposed, and Murad II resumed the throne. This double humiliation, being given the ultimate power and then having it stripped away, not once but twice, was burned into his soul. It taught him a series of brutal lessons, that he could trust no one, especially not the powerful viziers of his father's court. That authority had to be seized and held with an iron fist, not simply inherited, and that he would forever be seen as the boy until he achieved something so monumental, so world-shattering, that no one would ever dare question his power again. This experience did not break him. It tempered him, turning his ambition into a cold, patient, all-consuming fire. From the ashes of this public shame emerged a secret, driving obsession that would give his life its singular, terrifying purpose. This inner demon was the pursuit of Kuzul Elma, the red apple. This was a potent, almost mystical concept in Turkic folklore, a symbol of the ultimate prize, the unconquerable city that represented the final frontier of conquest and the key to world dominion. For generations of Turkish warriors, its identity shifted. Sometimes it was Rome, other times Vienna or Budapest. But for Mehmed and for the Ottomans of his era, the red apple was and could only be one place: Constantinople. This was not merely a strategic objective. It was a deep-seated psychological and civilizational imperative. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the capital of the Roman Empire, the bastion of Orthodox Christianity, and the greatest metropolis in the known world. It was a fortress city, protected by its legendary triple-layered Theodosian walls, which had repelled countless sieges by Arabs, Avars, and even his own ancestors. To conquer it was to succeed where all others had failed. For Mehmed personally, the red apple was the answer to his humiliation. Capturing Constantinople would be the monumental act that would silence all his critics, prove his manhood and his worthiness to rule, and erase the memory of the weak boy sultan who had been twice deposed. It was also a religious duty, fulfilling what was believed to be a prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who had reportedly said, Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will he be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. This prophecy transformed his personal ambition into a sacred mission, clothing his hunger for power in the mantle of divine will. Every decision he made after his final ascension to the throne, every political maneuver and military preparation was sublimated to this single burning goal. The red apple was the key to his psychological puzzle. It was a way to avenge his past, secure his future, and claim what he saw as his rightful destiny as a world conqueror blessed by God. His path to fulfilling this destiny was defined by his complex and ultimately lethal relationship with the most powerful man in the Ottoman court, the Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha. Halil was a product of the old Ottoman aristocracy, the Chanderlu family, which had supplied the empire with Grand Viziers for generations. He was a cautious, conservative statesman who had been Murad II's most trusted advisor. He represented the established order, an order that was deeply suspicious of the young, impetuous, and dangerously ambitious Mehmed. Their alliance was one of necessity, not trust. When Murad II died in 1451, it was Halil Pasha who managed the transition, ensuring Mehmed's swift and final ascension to the throne, sending messengers to secure his arrival in the capital before any of his rivals could act. For a brief moment, it seemed they would rule together, the young, energetic sultan and the wise, experienced vizier. But Mehmed had never forgiven him. He saw Halil as the architect of his earlier humiliation, the man who had engineered his deposition and who had always favored a more peaceful coexistence with Byzantium and the Christian powers. Halil believed that an attack on Constantinople was a reckless gamble that could provoke another massive crusade and endanger the entire Ottoman state. For Mehmed, this caution was tantamount to treason, an obstacle to his sacred destiny. For 2 years, he played a brilliant political game, outwardly listening to his Grand Vizier's counsel while secretly consolidating his own power and pushing forward with his war preparations. He cultivated younger, more aggressive advisors who shared his vision. The tension in the divan, the imperial council, must have been palpable. The old guard, led by Halil, urging restraint, and the young sultan's war party, hungry for glory. The final break came on the very day Constantinople fell. According to some accounts, as the city was being stormed, Halil Pasha was arrested. Mehmed, now the undisputed conqueror, the master of the world, no longer needed the man who had doubted him. Shortly after the victory, Halil Pasha was executed, his vast wealth confiscated. This was more than just the removal of a political rival. It was a revolution. It was Mehmed's declaration of independence, a brutal and unequivocal statement that the old ways were dead. By eliminating the most powerful member of the old aristocracy, he signaled the beginning of a new era of absolute centralized monarchical power, where the sultan's will was the only law. The gamble was over, and the master of the game had claimed his throne, free of all who had ever constrained him. Upon finally securing the throne in 1451, Mehmed's first actions were a chilling demonstration of the lessons he had learned about the nature of power. There would be no more weakness, no more hesitation. His first official act, sanctioned by Ottoman law to prevent civil war, was the execution of his infant half-brother, Ahmed, who was drowned in his bath. The chroniclers report that Mehmed then received the killer, Ali Bey, and said, "You have done well," before having him executed in turn to silence any complicity. It was an act of brutal pragmatism, securing his reign from the dynastic strife that had plagued his predecessors. With the home front secured by the silken cord, he immediately turned his gaze to the red apple. His next move was an act of breathtaking audacity and a direct violation of existing treaties with Byzantium. In the spring of 1452, he began the construction of a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus Strait, directly opposite a fortress built by his great-grandfather on the Asian side. He named it Rumeli Hisara, the Fortress of the Throat Cutter. The name was a declaration of intent. Together, the two fortresses would give the Ottomans complete control of the strait, allowing them to sever Constantinople's vital grain supply from the Black Sea and prevent any naval aid from Genoa's colonies from reaching the city. The construction itself was a spectacle of immense will. Mehmed was on site constantly, personally directing the work of thousands of masons and laborers who worked day and night. The fortress, with its massive towers, was completed in just over 4 months, a logistical miracle for the age. For the Byzantines, watching this monster rise on their doorstep, it was a terrifying and undeniable signal that the final siege was imminent. It was a strategic masterstroke and a piece of psychological warfare, a stone and mortar proclamation that the game had changed, and the young sultan they had once dismissed was coming for them, and this time, no one could stop him. The primary antagonist in this epic drama was not a man, but the ghost of an idea, embodied in the tragic figure of Constantine XV Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Romans. Constantine was a man defined by duty, courage, and the profound melancholy of presiding over the death of a civilization. He was no fool. He knew the empire he inherited in 1449 was a hollow shell. Byzantium was a head without a body, its domains reduced to the city of Constantinople, a few islands, and the despotate of the Morea in Greece. The city's population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling around inside walls built to protect 1 million. Its legendary wealth was gone, its palaces were crumbling, and its military was a shadow of its former glory, a tiny force supplemented by a handful of foreign mercenaries. Yet, Constantine carried the weight of 1,500 years of Roman history on his shoulders. He was the direct successor to Augustus, Constantine the Great, and Justinian. His title, Basilius Kai Autocrator ton Romaion, Emperor and Autocrat of the Romans, was, in his eyes and the eyes of the Orthodox world, the most exalted on earth. The conflict between him and Mehmed was thus a clash of two worlds and two historical narratives. For Mehmed, Byzantium was a decaying, illegitimate obstacle to a new, divinely ordained universal order. For Constantine, the Ottoman Sultan was a usurper, a barbarian chieftain whose growing power was an offense to the proper, God-given hierarchy of the world. Constantine did everything a doomed man could do. He sent desperate pleas for help to the powers of the West, offering the one thing he had left to bargain with: the submission of the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome, hoping to heal the Great Schism of 1054 in exchange for a new crusade. He oversaw frantic repairs to the ancient walls and tried to rally the spirits of his terrified people. He was a noble, dignified figure trapped by fate, a king in a tragedy of his own making, destined to be the last guardian of a legacy he knew he could not save. The fatal mistake that sealed Constantinople's doom was not made within its walls, but in the halls of power in Rome, Venice, and Genoa. It was a catastrophic failure of imagination and political will on the part of the Christian West, a psychological breaking point where centuries of rivalry and religious division triumphed over the instinct for collective survival. Constantine XV's desperate pleas for aid, his offer to end the 400-year-old schism between the Eastern and Western churches, were met with a disastrous combination of arrogance, greed, and theological pedantry. In Venice and Genoa, the great maritime rivals, the primary concern was not the survival of Christendom, but the preservation of their lucrative trade concessions in the Ottoman-controlled Levant. They saw Byzantium less as a sister civilization and more as a weakened competitor and a potential trade pawn. They played a double game, sending platitudes to the emperor while simultaneously negotiating with the sultan, each hoping to gain a commercial advantage over the other should the city fall. The papacy, under Pope Nicholas V, did make some effort to rally a response. However, his calls for a new crusade were largely ignored by the great monarchs of Europe, who were consumed by their own conflicts. The spiritual authority of the Pope had been severely damaged by decades of schism and was no longer sufficient to unite the fractious Christian kingdoms. Furthermore, within Constantinople itself, the proposed union of the churches was met with violent opposition. The populace, led by influential monks like Gennadios Scholarios, rioted under the slogan, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." They remembered the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western Crusaders had brutally sacked their city, and they viewed the Latins with a deeper hatred and suspicion than they did the Turks. This internal division fatally undermined Constantine's diplomatic efforts. The West saw a house divided and fatally underestimated the threat. They remembered the boy Sultan Mehmed from his first failed reign. They viewed him as an inexperienced, arrogant youth who was biting off more than he could chew. They simply could not conceive that this 21-year-old could succeed where so many legendary conquerors had failed. This colossal miscalculation, born of hubris and disunity, left Constantinople almost entirely alone. When help finally did arrive, a few hundred soldiers from Genoa led by the brave Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, it was far too little, far too late. The West had made its choice, and in doing so, had condemned the Second Rome to death. Mehmed, a master of exploiting his enemies' weaknesses, capitalized on the chaos and disunity of the West with ruthless efficiency. He understood that the coming battle would not be won by medieval tactics alone, but by a new kind of warfare, one founded on logistics, engineering, and overwhelming firepower. His greatest coup was securing the services of a Hungarian cannon founder named Orban. Orban was a master of his craft, a mercenary genius who had initially offered his services to the Byzantines. He promised Emperor Constantine XIII that he could build bronze cannons powerful enough to blast any wall in the world. But the dying empire was bankrupt. Constantine could not afford Orban's high fees, nor could he supply the vast quantities of raw materials the engineer required. Frustrated, Orban took his talents elsewhere. He went to the Ottoman court at Edirne, where he was granted an audience with Mehmed. The young sultan, unlike the emperor, immediately grasped the revolutionary potential of Orban's work. He asked the engineer if he could build a cannon capable of shattering the walls of Constantinople. When Orban confidently replied that he could, Mehmed gave him everything he needed: unlimited funds, mountains of bronze, and an army of craftsmen and laborers. The result of this collaboration was a technological marvel and a terrifying monster: the Great Bombard, sometimes called the Basilica. It was an immense cannon, over 27 feet long, capable of firing a 1,200-pound marble ball over a mile. It required hundreds of men and dozens of oxen to move, and could only be fired a few times a day. But its psychological and physical impact was devastating. The Great Bombard was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Mehmed's vision. It represented the fusion of Western technology and Eastern ambition, a sign that the Ottomans were not just another horde of steppe warriors, but a modern, organized military power willing to adopt and perfect the innovations of their enemies. While the West bickered and delayed, Mehmed was busy forging the instrument of their defeat, a weapon born from their own continent, but turned against them by a ruler with a singular, terrifying clarity of purpose. The siege of Constantinople, which began on the 6th of April, 1453, was the ultimate expression of Mehmed's will and the climax of his life's obsession. For 53 days, the world held its breath as the drama unfolded. The sensory assault was relentless and all-encompassing. The air itself thrummed with the constant, deafening thunder of the Great Bombard and dozens of smaller cannons, a percussive earthquake that never ceased, day or night. The sound shook the very stones of the city, fraying the nerves of the defenders, a constant reminder of the implacable force arrayed against them. For the defenders on the walls, it was a hellish existence of noise, dust, and sudden violent death, as massive stone balls smashed into the ancient ramparts, sending splinters of rock and men flying through the air. Mehmed's genius was not just in his firepower, but in his meticulous planning and innovative tactics. When the Byzantine defenders deployed a massive chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, blocking the Ottoman fleet from attacking the city's weaker sea walls, Mehmed responded with an act of almost unbelievable logistical audacity. He ordered his men to construct a massive roadway of greased logs, and over the course of a single night, they physically dragged 70 of his ships overland, up and over the hill of Galata, and down into the waters of the Golden Horn, completely bypassing the chain. For the exhausted defenders who awoke to see the enemy fleet suddenly in their protected harbor, it was a devastating psychological blow, a feat that seemed almost supernatural. The final assault came on the 29th of May. Preceded by a day of rest and prayer in the Ottoman camp, the attack began before dawn, a series of human waves thrown against the weakened walls. First the irregular Bashi bazooks, then the disciplined Anatolian troops, and finally, the elite, seemingly invincible Janissaries. In the chaotic, hand-to-hand fighting at the breaches, the Genoese commander Giustiniani was mortally wounded, and the command structure of the defense collapsed. Someone had forgotten to lock a small postern gate. The Kirkoporta and the first Ottoman banners appeared inside the city. Panic spread like fire. Emperor Constantine III, seeing that all was lost, cast off his imperial regalia and plunged into the fray, dying anonymously in the final desperate struggle. The world city, the queen of cities, had fallen. In the moment of his greatest triumph, as he rode his white charger through the grand avenues of the conquered city, Mehmed's mind was not on plunder or revenge, but on history and destiny. The psychology of this moment reveals the core of his paradoxical ambition. He made his way directly to the city's spiritual heart, the magnificent 1,000-year-old Basilica of Hagia Sophia. Dismounting, he entered the great church, stooped to pick up a handful of earth, and sprinkled it over his turban in a gesture of humility before God. But it was the humility of a master, not a servant. He saw the terrified Byzantine nobles and citizens huddled inside and assured them their lives would be spared. Then, he gave the order that would forever define his conquest, and Muezzin ascended the pulpit and chanted the Islamic call to prayer. Hagia Sophia was to become a mosque. This act was layered with meaning. It was, on one level, the ultimate symbol of Islamic victory over Christendom. But for Mehmed, it was something more. By preserving the building, by converting it rather than destroying it, he was absorbing its power, co-opting its immense spiritual and historical prestige for his own empire. He did not see himself as a barbarian sacking Rome like Alaric the Goth. He saw himself as the rightful successor to its legacy. In the days that followed, he began to formally use the title Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of the Roman Empire. This was no empty boast. In his view, and in the political theory of his world, an empire was defined by its capital. By conquering Constantinople, the seat of the Roman Empire for over a millennium, he had legally and legitimately inherited its titles and its universal claims. He was not Mehmed the Destroyer. He was Sultan Mehmed, the Roman Emperor, the unifier of Asia and Europe, the continuer of a legacy that he had now claimed for himself, for his dynasty, and for his faith. The hubris was monumental, but it was a calculated political hubris. He was telling the world that the old order was not just dead, but that he was its resurrection, remade in his own image. Even as he was remaking the world order, the new Caesar found his authority challenged not by the great kings of the West, but by a figure from his own past. A man who knew his methods and his cruelty intimately because they had been forged in the same fire. This was his sworn personal enemy, Vlad III of Wallachia, better known to history as Dracula, the Impaler. The conflict between Mehmed and Vlad was not a typical war of conquest. It was a deeply personal, psychological duel between two men who had grown up together as political hostages at the Ottoman court of Mehmed II. They had been brothers in captivity, learning the brutal lessons of Ottoman power politics side by side. Vlad, like Mehmed, understood that power grew from the barrel of a gun, or in his case, from the point of a stake. When Vlad returned to rule Wallachia, he initially served as an Ottoman vassal, but his deep-seated hatred for the empire that had held him captive soon led to open rebellion. He knew he could not defeat the vast Ottoman army in a conventional battle. Instead, he waged a campaign of pure terror, a form of asymmetrical warfare designed to break the morale of the Turkish forces. His weapon was atrocity. He perfected the art of impalement, a horrific method of execution where a victim was slowly skewered on a sharpened stake. When Mehmed led a massive army into Wallachia in 1462 to crush the rebellion, he was met not with pitched battles, but with a landscape of horror. He found poisoned wells, burned villages, and guerrilla ambushes. The climax of this campaign of terror came when the Sultan's army approached Vlad's capital of Targovishte. There, stretching for miles, they discovered a gruesome forest of the dead. 20,000 impaled Turkish prisoners and Bulgarian civilians, a silent, rotting army arranged in concentric circles. The stench of death was overwhelming. Even Mehmed, a man inured to bloodshed, was reportedly so sickened and shaken by the sight that he turned his army around and retreated. While he would eventually succeed in driving Vlad from his throne, the Impaler remained a thorn in his side for years, a sworn enemy who fought him not with cannons, but with a terrifying cruelty that mirrored the Sultan's own ruthlessness. While his wars raged, Mehmed engaged in an act of creation that was perhaps even more audacious than his conquests. He understood that to be a true Caesar, he needed more than just an army. He needed a world capital, a vibrant, cosmopolitan center for his new empire. The Constantinople he had conquered was a shadow of its former self, depopulated and decaying. His great project was to transform this ghost city into the magnificent metropolis of Istanbul. This was not a restoration. It was a reinvention. His first act was to repopulate the city. He did this through a combination of force and inducement. He ordered massive population transfers, forcing thousands of Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews from across his empire to relocate to the new capital. To attract others, especially the skilled artisans, merchants, and scholars he needed, he offered them tax breaks, free housing, and most importantly, a degree of religious freedom that was almost unheard of in the Europe of his day. Shortly after the conquest, he met with the Orthodox monk Gennadios Scholarios, the man who had famously opposed the union with the Catholic Church, and installed him as the new patriarch of the Orthodox Christian community. He created the Armenian Patriarchate and confirmed the Jewish Grand Rabbi. These communities were granted the right to live under their own religious laws and were protected by the state, forming the basis of the Ottoman millet system. This was not an act of liberal tolerance in the modern sense. It was a calculated act of imperial statecraft. Mehmed knew that the city's prosperity depended on these skilled minority communities. Simultaneously, he launched a building program of staggering scale. He commissioned the Grand Bazaar, which would become one of the largest covered markets in the world. He began construction of the Topkapi Palace, the vast complex that would serve as the political and administrative heart of the empire for centuries. He converted churches into mosques and built new ones, along with schools, hospitals, and public baths. Through this colossal effort, he breathed new life into the dying city, transforming Constantinople into Istanbul, a bustling, multi-ethnic, multi-religious jewel that would become the largest and wealthiest city in Europe, a fitting capital for the new Caesar. Beneath the grand sweep of geopolitics and war, the court of this new Caesar was a world of profound and fascinating contradictions, a place where Renaissance humanism coexisted with brutal autocracy. Mehmed himself was the embodiment of this paradox. On one hand, he was a ruthless, paranoid, and remote ruler. He was the first sultan to codify the law of fratricide, making it an official institution of the state. He ended the practice of the sultan dining with his viziers, instead communicating his will from behind a screen, creating a sense of divine remoteness. He was the absolute master of a state where his slightest whim was law. Yet this same man was a true intellectual, a Renaissance prince in the Ottoman mold. He was a gifted poet who wrote under the pen name Avni. He was a polyglot, reportedly fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Slavic languages. His library was filled with the works of Greek and Roman historians and philosophers, including a copy of Homer's Iliad. He had a passion for geography and commissioned new maps of the known world. He was a generous patron of the arts and sciences, inviting Muslim scholars, Italian artists, and Greek humanists to his court. In a famous and almost surreal episode, he requested that the Venetian Republic send him their best portrait painter. They sent Gentile Bellini, who spent several years at the Ottoman court, and painted the famous portrait of the Sultan that now hangs in London's National Gallery. It shows a man with a fine, arched nose, a contemplative, almost melancholy gaze, and a thin, determined mouth, the face of a scholar, not a warlord. His personal life was equally complex. The Topkapi Palace housed a massive harem, a highly structured institution that was not merely a place of pleasure but a vital political arena, where the mothers of potential heirs vied for influence. His relationships with his sons were fraught with the inherent tension of the Ottoman system, a mixture of affection and the constant, unspoken knowledge that they were all rivals for the same ultimate prize. This was the world Mehmed created, one of high culture and lethal politics, a place where a poet could order an execution and a philosopher could design a battle plan. Despite his monumental triumph at Constantinople, the new Caesar's reign was not an unbroken series of victories. His ambition soon ran into the hard realities of determined and capable opponents, who handed him some of his first and most humbling defeats. Two powers, in particular, emerged as the primary long-term adversaries to his expansionist dreams: the Maritime Republic of Venice and the land-based Kingdom of Hungary. Venice, the serene republic, was an empire of the sea. Its power was not in vast armies, but in its peerless navy and its chain of fortified trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean and Aegean. The fall of Constantinople was a major blow to Venetian commercial interests, and the Republic quickly became the leading Christian protagonist in a long and grinding war against Ottoman naval power. For 16 years, from 1463 to 1479, they fought a grueling war for control of the sea lanes, a conflict of sieges, raids, and naval battles that drained the resources of both empires. The Venetian lion, though battered, refused to be tamed, proving that mastery of the land did not automatically translate to mastery of the sea. On land, the primary obstacle was the Kingdom of Hungary, a powerful state that served as the southeastern bastion of Catholic Europe. The Hungarians were led by one of the most brilliant military commanders of the 15th century, John Hunyadi, known as the White Knight. Hunyadi was a veteran of the wars against Mehmed's father and understood Ottoman tactics better than any other Christian leader. He became Mehmed's nemesis, the one general the Sultan could not seem to defeat. The emergence of these new, persistent threats created the first cracks in Mehmed's aura of invincibility. His conquest of Constantinople had stunned the world, making him seem like an unstoppable force of nature. But the long wars against Venice and the frustrating stalemate with Hungary demonstrated that his ambition had limits. The empire he was building was powerful, but it was not omnipotent. These conflicts also had a profound internal effect, as the immense cost of constant warfare began to strain the Ottoman treasury, forcing Mehmed to implement unpopular tax increases and land confiscations, sowing the first seeds of discontent within his own realm. The defining act of Mehmed's later reign, a decision that revealed the boundless, almost terrifying scope of his ambition, was the gamble he took in the year 1480. Having consolidated his power in the Balkans and Anatolia, and having fought the Venetians to a standstill, he set his sights on the ultimate prize, the original red apple Rome itself. This was the logical endpoint of his claim to be the Caesar of the Roman Empire. To truly cement that title, he needed to unite the two Romes, the new Rome of Constantinople and the old Rome of Italy. His plan was audacious to the point of seeming insane. He launched a full-scale invasion of the Italian peninsula, the heartland of the papacy and the cradle of the Renaissance. An Ottoman fleet crossed the Adriatic and captured the southern Italian city of Otranto. The sack of Otranto sent a shockwave of absolute terror across Europe. The accounts of the massacre that followed, where the archbishop was sawn in half and over 800 citizens were beheaded for refusing to convert to Islam, created a panic unseen since the days of the Mongol invasions. It seemed as if Mehmed was on the verge of marching on Rome itself. Pope Sixtus IV prepared to evacuate the city, and calls for a new, desperate crusade echoed across the continent. The invasion of Otranto was the physical manifestation of Mehmed's ultimate goal. It was a statement that his ambitions did not stop at the Bosphorus or the Danube. He saw himself as a new Alexander, a unifier of East and West, and he believed it was his destiny to bring the entire Roman world under his rule. The psychology behind this decision was one of supreme, almost divine self-confidence. After the fall of Constantinople, he believed himself to be invincible, an instrument of God's will. The Otranto gamble was the act of a man who no longer recognized any limits to his own power. A fateful decision that aimed to redraw the map of the world and bring about a final confrontation between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Christendom. Long before the audacious Italian gamble, however, Mehmed had suffered a catastrophic military defeat that served as a brutal lesson in the limits of his power and shattered his carefully cultivated aura of invincibility. This was the great humiliation at the Siege of Belgrade in 1456. Following his conquest of Constantinople, a triumphant Mehmed marched north with a massive army, estimated at nearly 100,000 men, and a formidable siege train of over 200 cannons. His objective was the strategic fortress of Belgrade, which guarded the Danube River and was the gateway to the heart of Hungary and Central Europe. He was supremely confident, believing that no fortress could withstand the firepower that had brought down the walls of Constantinople. But at Belgrade, he faced his nemesis, the brilliant Hungarian commander John Hunyadi. Hunyadi, aided by the fiery preacher John of Capistrano, who had raised a peasant crusader army, mounted a defense of legendary ferocity. The siege lasted for weeks, with the Ottoman cannons pounding the walls day and night. On the 21st of July, Mehmed ordered an all-out assault, and the Janissaries managed to breach the walls and pour into the city. But instead of collapsing, the defenders, inspired by Hunyadi, rallied and trapped the Janissaries in a brutal street-to-street battle. In a stunning turn of events, Hunyadi then led a desperate, unexpected counterattack out of the city, overran the Ottoman cannon emplacements, and stormed the Sultan's main camp. The invincible Ottoman army was thrown into chaos and panic. In the midst of the fighting, Mehmed himself was wounded in the thigh by an arrow and nearly killed. He was forced into a humiliating and disorderly retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and his entire siege train. The defeat at Belgrade was a profound shock, both personally and politically. For the first time, Mehmed, the great conqueror, had been decisively beaten in a major battle. The news of the Christian victory was celebrated across Europe. For Mehmed, it was a bitter lesson that hubris was a dangerous flaw, and that the road to European conquest would be far harder than he had imagined. It was a searing catastrophe that tempered his youthful arrogance with a new, harder-edged realism. The final years of the conqueror's life were a slow descent into a state of increasing isolation and paranoia, a period where the immense pressures of empire building began to take their toll. The man who had conquered a world found himself increasingly a prisoner within his own palace. The constant warfare that had defined his reign, from the long struggle against Venice to the campaigns in the Balkans and the Black Sea, had placed an immense strain on the Ottoman state. The treasury was depleted, forcing him to take ever more drastic financial measures, including debasing the currency and confiscating the lands of the religious foundations and the old aristocracy. These policies created powerful enemies within his own elite. The court at Topkapi Palace, once a center of intellectual vibrancy, became a hotbed of whispered conspiracies and deadly factional rivalries, particularly between the supporters of his two rival sons, Bayezid and Cem. Mehmed grew more remote and suspicious, trusting fewer and fewer of his advisors. He was haunted by the fear of betrayal and assassination, a fear rooted in the violent realities of the Ottoman succession system that he himself had codified. He had lived by the sword and the silken cord, and he knew that the same instruments could easily be turned against him. The grand architect of an empire was now facing the inevitable problem of all-powerful autocrats, ensuring its survival beyond his own lifetime. The rivalry between his sons threatened to plunge the empire into the very civil war that his policy of fratricide was meant to prevent. Bayezid, the elder, was seen as more pious and peaceful, favored by the religious establishment, and the Janissaries. Cem, the younger, was more like his father, a cultured, ambitious, and energetic warrior. The stage was set for a conflict upon his death, and Mehmed, the master strategist, seemed unable to control the ambitions he had unleashed within his own family. A palpable sense of decay and foreboding began to settle over the court, the collapse from within seeming a far greater threat than any external enemy. The hero's finale, when it came, was not the glorious death on the battlefield that he might have imagined, but a sudden, ignominious, and deeply mysterious end that perfectly mirrored the conspiratorial world he had created. On the 3rd of May, 1481, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, now 50 years old but aged by a life of relentless campaigning, died at his military camp in Hunkar Çayırı, near Gebze. He was on the march, at the head of a massive new army, but his ultimate destination remains one of history's great unanswered questions. Was he heading east to challenge the Mamluks of Egypt for leadership of the Islamic world, or was he turning west again to reinforce the Ottoman position in Otranto and renew his march on Rome? He never arrived. He was suddenly struck down by a violent illness, suffering from intense stomach pains and vomiting. He died within days. The circumstances were immediately suspect. His personal physician was a Persian, and some sources suggest he was in the pay of the Venetians, who had every reason to want the Sultan dead. However, the most compelling evidence points to a conspiracy much closer to home, orchestrated by his own son and heir, Bayezid. Bayezid and his faction at court, who favored a more conservative and less warlike policy, feared that another of Mehmed's costly campaigns would ruin the state. They may have conspired with the Grand Vizier to have the Sultan poisoned. The aftermath was telling. Upon Mehmed's death, the Janissaries, loyal to Bayezid, revolted in the capital, murdered the Grand Vizier, and ensured Bayezid's swift accession to the throne. It was a deeply ironic end for the master of intrigue and the architect of absolute power. The man who had eliminated his own infant brother to secure his throne was likely struck down by the ambition of his own son. The great conqueror, the terror of Christendom, did not fall to a crusader's sword or a Hungarian cannonball, but was likely felled by a poisoned chalice within his own camp, a victim of the very system of ruthless power politics he had perfected. The legacy of Mehmed II is a grand conflict of interpretations, a historical figure so monumental that he is viewed through two completely irreconcilable lenses. He is a man with two faces, one a hero, the other a villain, depending entirely on which side of the Bosphorus one stands. In the modern Turkish world, and for much of Islamic civilization, he is, and always will be, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror. He is the heroic, almost mythical figure who fulfilled a sacred prophecy, the founder of the true Ottoman Empire, and the leader who transformed a regional power into a world-spanning caliphate. He is a symbol of national pride, a testament to Turkish genius, will, and destiny. His conquest of Constantinople is celebrated not as an act of destruction, but as a liberation, an event that ushered in a golden age of power, prosperity, and culture. His name adorns bridges, universities, and entire districts of the city he remade. He is the father of the nation, the architect of its greatest glory. But to the Western and Eastern Orthodox Christian worlds, his legacy is precisely the opposite. He is the Antichrist, the great destroyer, the man who extinguished the light of Byzantium, the final bastion of Roman civilization and Orthodox Christianity. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is seen not as a beginning, but as a cataclysmic end, a cultural trauma whose scars remain to this day. He is remembered as the desecrator of Hagia Sophia, the enslaver of peoples, the terrifying warlord whose shadow loomed over Europe for centuries. In Greek folklore, he is the archetypal tyrant, and the fall of the city is mourned as a pivotal moment in a long history of suffering under Turkish rule. This profound duality is his true legacy. He is a figure so powerful that he cannot be neutralized or seen objectively. He must be either revered or reviled. He is a permanent fixture in the foundation of two opposing civilizational narratives, a conqueror whose victory was so absolute that it continues to define the identity of both the victors and the vanquished more than 500 years later. So we return to the central paradox, the core question of his life. How could Mehmed be both the destroyer of Byzantium and the new Caesar of Rome? The final answer lies in understanding that for him, and in the political philosophy of his era, there was no contradiction whatsoever. He saw the Roman Empire not as a specific ethnicity, Greek, or a specific religion, Christianity, but as a universal political concept, a world-spanning, divinely sanctioned state with a single ruler and a single capital. The Byzantines had held the title and the capital for 1,000 years, but in Mehmed's view, they had proven themselves unworthy. They were weak, divided, and decaying, incapable of defending the imperial legacy they had inherited. Their empire was a hollow shell, a name without power. By conquering Constantinople, he was not committing an act of destruction. He was performing an act of legitimate transfer. He was seizing a title that the previous owners had forfeited through their own weakness. It was a hostile takeover, not a demolition. His adoption of the title Kaiser-i-Rum was the cornerstone of this new political reality. By claiming the legacy of Caesar, he was elevating himself and his dynasty from mere tribal chieftains or Ghazi warlords to the inheritors of the most prestigious secular title in the world. It was a masterstroke of political legitimization aimed at multiple audiences. To his new Christian subjects, it offered a thread of continuity, suggesting that the Roman Empire had not died, but had simply changed management. To the rival powers of Europe, it was a defiant claim to equality and even superiority, positioning him not as a foreign invader, but as a player in their own game of imperial succession. He broke the physical body of the Byzantine state, its armies, its walls, its emperor. But he did so in order to capture and inhabit its soul, its claim to universal dominion. He was the ultimate creator through destruction, the man who tore down a failing edifice to use its ancient, hallowed stones to build the foundation of his own, far grander imperial dream. The verdict of history on Mehmed the Conqueror is that he was an agent of profound and irreversible transformation, a man whose life and actions represent the violent and definitive end of one historical epoch and the birth of another. He was the closing bracket on the Middle Ages. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is one of the most commonly cited dates for the end of the medieval period, and for good reason. It was not just the fall of a city, it was the collapse of a 1,000-year-old political and psychological order. It shattered the medieval Christian conception of the world, the res publica Christiana, by demonstrating that its eastern bastion was no longer impregnable. The flood of Greek scholars fleeing the fallen city to Italy, carrying with them ancient manuscripts and knowledge, was a significant catalyst for the flourishing of the Renaissance. The Ottoman control of the old trade routes to the east provided a powerful economic incentive for European powers like Spain and Portugal to seek new sea routes, leading directly to the Age of Discovery and Columbus's voyage in 1492. Mehmed's life is a universal lesson in the power of singular vision and indomitable will to reshape the world. He demonstrated how a leader who can master new technologies, the cannon, exploit the divisions of his enemies, the disunity of the West, and fuse them with a powerful and unifying ideology, the concepts of Ghazi and Caesar, can achieve what seems impossible. His story is a testament to the clash of civilizations, not as a simple battle of good versus evil, but as a complex process of conquest, absorption, and synthesis. He did not simply defeat Byzantium. He consumed it, integrating its administrative traditions, its symbols, and its imperial pretensions into a new and dynamic Ottoman Islamic civilization that would dominate a significant portion of the world for the next 4 centuries. He is the ultimate proof that history is not a gentle evolution, but is more often a story written in fire and blood by ruthless visionaries. The final, enduring frame of Mehmed's story, the image that encapsulates his entire paradoxical legacy, is the skyline of the city he remade. It is the silhouette of the Hagia Sophia at dusk. You see the immense, ancient dome, a masterpiece of Roman engineering that for 900 years was the largest and most glorious church in all of Christendom, a space designed to give mortals a glimpse of heaven on earth. For centuries, its form was the singular, defining feature of the horizon. But now, rising up around it, slender and elegant as rockets aimed at the sky, are the 4 towering Ottoman minarets, added by Mehmed and his successors. They do not obscure the dome. They frame it, they embrace it, they redefine it. The structure is at once a church and a mosque, a living testament to 2 faiths and 2 empires, one built directly upon the foundations of the other. The shadow of the minaret falls across the ancient Christian dome, a permanent, haunting, and strangely beautiful fusion of conquest and continuity. This single image is the physical embodiment of Mehmed's entire project. It is the story of a conqueror who preserved what he captured, a Caesar who co-opted the symbols of his predecessor, a man who built a new world by placing his own indelible mark upon the most sacred treasures of the old. This is the delicious, complex aftertaste of his saga, not a story of simple destruction, but of a profound and violent transformation that forever blurred the lines between worlds, leaving behind a legacy as monumental, as contested, and as breathtaking as the skyline of Istanbul itself.